Hello folks, this is Dave. I thought maybe I would do something a little bit different today. Let's look at potential Hall of Famers. Here coming up shortly, in early December, the contemporary baseball era player ballots will be submitted for the class of 2026. And on that ballot, there are several players, 8 to be exact. They are Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, Carlos Delgado, Jeff Kent, Dale Murphy, Don Mattingly, Gary Sheffield, and Fernando Valenzuela. So what I thought I would do is let's just pick this apart just a little bit. Let's create our own ballot. And let's do first baseman. There's two first basemen on this list, Carlos Delgado and Don Mattingly. And why don't we compare these with other first basemen that sometimes we believe they should have been in the Hall of Fame. So those that I thought we should compare are Will Clark, Carlos Delgado, Steve Garvey, Mark Grace, Keith Hernandez, Don Mattingly, and John Olerud. So what I've done here is I have put the years that they played up here from 1969 through 2009. And so here is the time when each of these players played. Will Clark, 86 to 2000. Carlos Delgado overlapped that. Steve Garvey was before most of that. Mark Grace, some overlap. Keith Hernandez overlapped a lot with Steve Garvey and some with Don Mattingly and the others. Don Mattingly here, sort of in the center of this range, and John Olerud also down here that overlapped with several. So what I did was I took all of their numbers and created a spreadsheet here. And you can see their names along the top here as shown here. And the dates that they played, the number of seasons they played, and I put some categories down the side here. Also, we'll look at the black ink test, and we'll look at what their defensive numbers look like. Then the other thing, I did some conditional formatting, and it gets a little busy here, but green means they led the 7 players in that category. So in other words, if I look at just seasons played, if I look at seasons played along the top, 19 is the most, has green, and 14 is the least. And then there's shading between each of them. So a greener shading means closer to the top, and oranger means closer to the bottom. So it gets a little bit busy here. Also did that also for the black ink test. I didn't do all these, it'd be way too busy, but you can see black ink test here, the most and the least. And defensive statistics or defensive categories down here. So here I've highlighted the high and the low for each category, for each player. For example, Steve Garvey played the most seasons, so I've highlighted him with green. Don Mattingly played the least seasons, he has 14. I also looked at WAR. So this is their career WAR, is in the left column for each one. And then I've normalized it to what their WAR would be in 162 games. So a season. So therefore, they're all normalized to 162 games. So if you look here, Keith Hernandez had the highest WAR in 17 seasons, but for 162 games, he also had the highest WAR. And the lowest WAR, both by season and by 162 games, is Steve Garvey. This next one here, if you take all the averages of all these, they average just over 16 seasons. So what I did was I normalized again to 16 seasons. So I took their WARs and factored them by 16/15ths, so he would be slightly higher. And these are a bit rounded, so they're not going to be precise. They're close. So Keith Hernandez had, again, the highest WAR for 16 seasons, if he played those 16 seasons. You can see it's a little bit higher than this, because not all seasons, they didn't play the same number. So if they came up early in their career and didn't play very many games, their rookie season, or maybe they're up and down, it'd be a little bit different. So here, in any case, Keith Hernandez in 16 seasons, 64, and Steve Garvey again, 41 WAR. Then I looked at 16 seasons of 162 games. So in other words, this number divided, so in other words, this number multiplied by 162 games, and you get these numbers here. So Keith Hernandez, the highest, and Steve Garvey, the lowest. So for these guys, they're pretty much identical. And then most of these categories here are just accumulation type statistics. So to me, they don't mean a whole lot. But I did normalize them to 162 games down here. So first of all, here's the number of games: Mattingly the least, Garvey the most. Games per season. So here I took out the seasons that they were just partially up and down, maybe with a club, or at the very end of their career when they really weren't starters. I just looked at those years where they were starters. And so this just means, did they get themselves on the field, or were they hurt a lot? So you can see Will Clark, 132 games per season on average. Steve Garvey, 149. Not a lot different for the others. Plate appearances, I don't really think that matters a lot, but you can see that Don Mattingly had the most plate appearances and hits per 162 games. Steve Garvey had the most hits, but he played 19 seasons. Home runs, Carlos Delgado, and RBIs, he was the leader of all these guys, where Mark Grace, Keith Hernandez, not a lot of power, so they were lower. Batting average, Don Mattingly had the highest. Carlos Delgado still respectable at 280. On base percentage, John Olerud, almost 400, and Steve Garvey the lowest at 329. Slugging, Carlos Delgado, OPS plus. He had a lot of power, and those numbers increase there. And the lowest OPS plus, Steve Garvey. So then just some other things here. Championships, All-Star. Again, some of these, All-Star, MVP, Gold Glove, Silver Sluggers are all kind of subjective. That is, people vote and not necessarily always consider what they should be considering, perhaps. Anyway, you can see that Steve Garvey had 10 All-Star appearances as opposed to Carlos Delgado, even though he was a slugger, had only 2, and John Olerud had only 2 All-Star appearances. MVPs, Garvey, Hernandez, and Mattingly. Gold Glove, Hernandez. Mattingly was high. Carlos Delgado didn't get any. Silver Sluggers. Here's Carlos Delgado. Oop, that should have been green, shouldn't it? But that's, and then Don Mattingly. And batting title, Hernandez, Mattingly, and Olerud each had batting titles. The black ink test is proposed by Bill James. In other words, if you look at Baseball Reference and see those players who have the most times leading the league in a statistic, whether it's home runs, RBIs, batting average, and so forth, and they're each weighted for points for home runs, RBIs, batting average, and so forth, down to at-bats and triples, not really as important. But if you look at the black ink, so here I'm showing Babe Ruth, many black ink that are indicated here. And here's the one for Don Mattingly, the one who leads First Baseman that we're comparing in black ink with 23. And this is what his looks like. So quite a bit different from Babe Ruth, but that's who we're comparing now. Now let's look at defense for these first basemen. So the first line is defensive WAR, defensive wins above replacement. You can see those numbers vary from very low, negative, and positive to higher. And so most all these are negative numbers. First basemen tend not have the effect on the overall outcome of the game. You can see here, Keith Hernandez has the highest WAR, career WAR, of 1.3, which normalizes to 0.1 win above replacement in a season, 162 game season. Also notice John Olerud has a 1.4, a minus 1.4 lifetime WAR, which is good, decent, and minus 0.1, 162 game WAR. So you can see it's not a big effect on the game, at least computationally. Compare that to minus 17 for Carlos Delgado with a minus 1.4, 162 game WAR. The next line is errors. Don Mattingly, see, has the least amount, 68. Remember, he had the least amount of seasons. John Olerud had the lowest 162 game error rate of about 6. As compared, and that's about similar to Don Mattingly, even though Olerud had more errors in his career. Compare that to Will Clark, who had many more errors, but that's so 11 as compared to Olerud's 6, about double the amount of errors in a 162 game season. These next lines are first baseman range factor per game. You can see they're all about 9. And the next line is the league average range factor for the years that these players played. So they're all different. You can see that they're all slightly different because they all played in different years. If they played in the same years, their numbers would be exactly the same. So you look at this one here, John Olerud's range factor is higher than the league average. So if you take the difference and take the percentage of that, he's 7.2% higher range factor than the average league first baseman. just by taking the difference and taking the percentage. You can see Don Mattingly is 0.6, and down to actually Will Clark is the next highest with 3.3% better than the league average. And Steve Garvey is actually below league average, and Carlos Delgado is right at league average. So let's see if we can wrap this up here. So here is back to the top of the sheet. I have the green cells, and I have the dark orange cells, and now I've also made the second place finisher. So the second to the most is in a lighter green, and the second to the bottom is in a lighter orange. So you can see through here, it just kind of tends to make the things that are reddish, more reddish. You kind of see it maybe a trend here. Will Clark, really strong in the slash line here. Carlos Delgado, strong in the slash line, a lot of power here, a lot of green. Steve Garvey, maybe not so much. You see a little lower, but he had more accumulative stats. Mark Grace just sort of in the middle of the pack there somewhere. Keith Hernandez, you can see very strong in the WAR because largely his defensive portion of that, and not a big negative number there, and but lower in some of the offensive numbers here. Slash line a little bit up and down here. Don Mattingly played fewer seasons here, so he doesn't have the accumulation, but you can see the number of hits per year is high. His RBIs actually per 162 is pretty high, highest batting average, and then the slash lines are sort of normal. John Olerud, again, good defensively, so his WAR is pretty high, and but not much else down the rest of his column. Slash line's kind of middle of the pack there. And here you can see these are, again, I think subjective. Steve Garvey, a lot of all-star games, MVP, voted on, very popular player, very good for his era. Not a lot of competition, but perhaps in the first base. And then you can see a lot of lower orangish colors here. The slash line, the black ink test, again, Don Mattingly highest, Keith Hernandez next, lowest is Mark Grace, and then middle of the pack, and then John Olerud doesn't have a lot of votes for things. And defensively, I think better defense, the way this thing worked out was better defense on the right side. John Olerud, I think, is the better defender of all of them. Keith Hernandez is maybe next, or they're pretty close to each other, at least per the numbers. Don Mattingly, decent as well. And then the poorer defenders are on the left side here, generally. So that's it. Take a look. What do you think? I know this is a lot of stuff. I can provide you with these spreadsheets if anybody wants to nerd out with those. Otherwise, you can just do kind of stop the video, take a look. I'm not sure you need to dig into it real deep here. You may have opinions going into this anyway. There are other non-statistical considerations that may weigh positively or negatively on these players. And so these are all things to be considered. My spreadsheet crashed when I was finalizing this video, and as I was reconstructing it, I left out the JAWS line, which is a interesting summary which may include almost everything here except defense. A player's JAWS is their career WAR average with their 7-year peak WAR, and it includes only batting. Defense is not included in this. So you can see here our 7 candidates: Keith Hernandez with a 50.8 JAWS, John Olerud was second, about 49, and then toward the bottom at the bottom we have Steve Garvey, 33, and Mark Grace, 38. And Carlos Delgado, 39, and Will Clark about right in the middle at 46.3. So the one thing I didn't do was I tried to avoid the steroid users or rumored steroid users, or however you want to classify that. So 2 other candidates I could have put on this list are Jason Giambi and Rafael Palmeiro, and both have been linked to steroids, and I just didn't want to get into that, so I left them off. I'm sorry if they are somebody you feel strongly about, but for this exercise, I just left them off. And last of all, what's the point of all this? That what I propose is, if you're willing and you want to, let's make a contest out of this, or let's make a poll out of this. I would like you in the comments below to submit 3 names, first, second, and third, and we will count up the number of ballots that each have for first, second, third places. We will weight them appropriately, similar to the way they do Hall of Fame voting. And we will see who comes out the winners here for second and third. So what's the incentive here? Well, besides for just some good, clean fun, so I propose let's make it worth your while. What I'm proposing to do is give you a prize for doing this. That is, we will have a drawing, and I have 3 prizes that I'm going to give out. And what they are Martin DeHigo cards from Scott at Reindeer Studios. So I'm buying 3 of those cards. When we're all done here, anybody who has voted, put 3 names down on the bottom of this video in the comments. I'll enter you in the contest. Spin a wheel. I'm sure I can make that work, or figure out how to make it work. And we will give some cards away. So what I propose is that I will count up all the votes on December 14th, midnight. That's a Sunday, midnight Sunday, the 14th. And anybody who has put a comment in with their votes, I'll enter you into the drawing, and we'll give away 3 of Scott's Martin DeHigo cards. How's that sound? I appreciate you watching this. I know there's a lot of nerdy stuff in here, and I probably didn't explain it very well, but vote anyway. I appreciate it. I appreciate y'all watching. Y'all come back now. Here.